Well, if you're looking for a crumb of optimism in the terrible things that are going on in Kyiv, even as we speak, the crumb of optimism is that the Russian negotiating technique is to be absolutely brutal and hardline and unyielding until the last moment. And you can make the argument that what's going on in Kyiv now is intended to tell Trump and Zelensky for their talks tomorrow and for the ongoing contacts, which are actually going on all over the place, as far as I can make out at the moment, that the Russians are not going to be a pushover. I don't think it says that the Russians are not willing to make concessions. That behind the scenes, everybody is expressing guarded optimism about the way things are moving. But it is intended to remind everyone of how nasty Russia can be if it chooses to be.
Right, and that's the point, that this is what we can do. So it's a negotiating position to show the strength of the Russian Federation at this point is perhaps, as you say, a crumb of optimism. They could be willing to accept some of this deal that's going to be discussed tomorrow.
Yes, and I think there are signs that they are willing to do so. I mean, they've, for example, actually way back at the Anchorage meeting, the Russians agreed with the Americans that provided the Americans were prepared to be more open on Russia seizing extra territory, the Russians would allow all of this stuff about security guarantees for Ukraine to go forward. And that, in effect, is what's happened. And I think of all the bits and pieces which come together tomorrow between Zelensky and Trump, that is the one to be most optimistic about in terms of the progress that's been made.
Yeah, and those security guarantees aren't quite joining NATO, but it's Article 5-like, isn't it? And the Americans have used this phrase, platinum security guarantees, which I wonder if we'll get some more details about that. Are you any clear as to what that actually means in terms of Ukraine's security?
Well, first of all, we need to be clear. The Russians have been absolutely inflexible since the beginning that there will be no Western troops in Ukraine. So you're looking at some sort of reassurance force, which the Europeans are working on, which won't be in Ukraine, will be, as it were, over the horizon. But the Europeans are very careful. They're not militarily as strong as they would like to be. And they are looking for some sort of US backup. And that's what Zelensky will want to extract from Trump tomorrow. And all the signs are that Trump is willing to concede some sort of backup of that sort.
Yeah, back to that backstop. We heard Sir Keir Starmer talking a lot about that, didn't we, earlier in the year, that was essential if this reassurance force from the Europeans, France, Britain, and others was going to be in Ukraine. Now, where do we think we are with the territorial issue, Sir Tony? Because, of course, the Russians in their 28-point plan wanted territory that they hadn't taken militarily yet. That was rejected out of hand by the Ukrainians, of course. There seems to have been a slight softening, if that's fair, of the rhetoric by President Zelensky seems to suggest that there could be some concession in territory. What's your sense of it?
I think this is still the hardest issue. Yes, Zelensky is talking about a demilitarized zone and all of that. I see no sign at all that the Russians are willing to abandon their demand, which they believe the Americans signed on to take over the whole of the Donbass. There's talk about Russia conceding territory elsewhere to balance off the exchange. And I suspect the Russians are open to that. In fact, I think they've said so quietly to the Americans. But this still remains extraordinarily difficult. And I think it's very unlikely that Zelensky and Trump are going to solve the problem tomorrow.
Which then leaves us at the same point of impasse, doesn't it? That despite where we find ourselves in terms of everything else being close to agreed, that main point is still there. And how does that get resolved, if not having to be resolved militarily?
Well, let's not get too gloomy about all this. This is, the war's been going on for nearly 4 years. Talks initiated by Trump only really began a few months ago. And it's taken a long time for people even to agree to talk to each other. And in fact, the Europeans are only just beginning to think about themselves talking to the Americans, themselves talking to the Russians. Nevertheless, these talks quietly, under rather careful and, it seems to me, competent US management, have edged, as I said, towards progress on security guarantees, have edged towards progress on, for example, one thing that Russia is absolutely insisting on is that Ukraine will never join NATO. And there has been some positive noises on that, even from Ukraine, although Zelensky seemed to go back on that last week. They are making very gradual progress. Everybody is very carefully saying, yes, there's movement taking place. Happily, everyone's being cautious enough not to go into very deep detail. These things work better when conducted confidentially. I suspect, as I say, tomorrow is not going to be the end of the process, but could mark a useful further step forward.
Absolutely. Well, we can take that, can't we? So, Tony Brenton, I appreciate your time. My best to you and your family this season. And thank you very much for your expertise, as always.